You probably know the name Lucky Luciano, maybe from movies, mob documentaries, or gangster lists online. But here's what most people don't know. Without Lucky Luciano, there would be no five families, no commission, and no mafia as we know it today. The modern American mob, with its rules, structure, and hierarchy, was literally engineered by this man. And he didn't do it with brute force alone. He did it with strategy, betrayal, vision, and more than a little blood. This is the story of how a gangster in custom suits from the Lower East Side rewired the underworld from a loose collection of rival thugs into a global criminal empire, and how the Commission, his criminal version of a boardroom, gave the Mafia its most powerful and dangerous innovation yet. From my perspective as a historian, there's a clear before and after in the American Mafia. Before Luciano, organized crime in the US was a mess. It was tribal, it was local, it was brutal in all the wrong ways. Bosses ruled their boroughs like feudal lords. They'd rather kill over insults than collaborate for profits, and perhaps most crucially, they were still caught up in old-world Sicilian vendettas that had no place in America's fast-changing criminal landscape. To understand how Lucky Luciano transformed that, we need to go back to the 1920s, Prohibition-era New York City. The booze was flowing, the profits were massive, and the competition was savage. Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs were fighting over routes, clubs, docks, and bribes. Everyone was making money, but no one was safe. The turf wars were explosive, and at the top of the Italian crime scene stood a man named Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria. Now, Masseria was old-school Sicilian. He believed in absolute loyalty, ruling by fear, and keeping power tightly within his inner circle of Italian-born men. He didn't trust outsiders, not Irish, not Jewish, not even American-born Italians. This put him at odds with a younger generation of mobsters, guys like Lucky Luciano, who were born or raised in America and saw opportunity in cross-ethnic alliances. Luciano, meanwhile, was already building quiet relationships with men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Jewish gangsters with brains, firepower, and connections. Together they saw something the old bosses didn't, that crime, like business, could scale. Luciano wasn't just hustling in the streets, he was absorbing the economics. He saw that prohibition rackets, labor unions, gambling operations, and political payoffs could be unified into a cooperative syndicate. But that vision couldn't happen as long as men like Masseria were in charge, and that's where things turned bloody. The so-called Castellammarese War broke out in the early 1930s, a brutal internal mafia conflict between Masseria and his rival, Salvatore Maranzano, both vying to become boss of bosses. Bodies piled up, gun battles happened in broad daylight. It wasn't just a war over territory, it was a war over philosophy, the old Sicilian way versus the American way. Luciano, originally aligned with Masseria, began to see him as a liability. Masseria's paranoia was choking profits. His refusal to work with non-Italians was limiting growth, and his war with Maranzano was killing business. So Luciano did the unthinkable. He flipped on his own boss. In 1931, Luciano orchestrated Masseria's assassination in a Coney Island restaurant. Legend says he excused himself to the bathroom, and while he was gone, his allies, including Bugsy Siegel, shot Masseria dead. With Masseria gone, Maranzano stepped into the top position and declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. But here's the twist. Luciano had no interest in replacing one dictator with another. Just months later, he had Maranzano murdered too, this time in his office, by Jewish gunmen disguised as IRS agents. 2 bosses, 2 betrayals, 2 hits. And just like that, Lucky Luciano removed the 2 most powerful mafia figures in New York and claimed the throne not as a dictator, but as an organizer. From my perspective as a historian, this is where Lucky Luciano's real genius begins. Because instead of ruling by fear, he introduced something the mafia had never seen before, a corporate structure. Luciano abolished the idea of a boss of all bosses. In its place, he created a commission, a council of the most powerful families in New York and across the country. Each family had a boss, an underboss, and a consigliere. And rather than settle disputes with bullets, families would bring issues to the commission for arbitration. It was, in essence, a criminal United Nations. The commission's founding members included the bosses of what would become the 5 families of New York, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families, plus key players from Chicago, Buffalo, and other major cities. Lucchese didn't just centralize power, he stabilized it. Murders dropped, profits rose, and for a time the mafia operated with the discipline and efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. But this wasn't just about reducing violence. Lucchese understood something fundamental. Visibility equals vulnerability. If mobsters could stay off the front page, they could stay off the FBI's radar. That's why the commission ruled not just on disputes, but on matters of strategy, whether a hit would be approved, whether a territory could be expanded, and how to divide national rackets like narcotics and labor unions. This was also when national coordination took off. Through the commission, the mob could run cross-country operations. Chicago controlled the Midwest, the West Coast worked through LA bosses like Jack Dragner, and the East Coast families coordinated ports, unions, and drug routes. It was sophisticated, it was invisible, and it was effective, until it wasn't. For a while, Luciano's system worked like clockwork. The commission reduced unnecessary violence and created protocols for resolving disputes. But as with all power structures, the cracks came not from outside, but from within. Let's zoom in on one of the earliest and clearest signs of this. In 1957, Albert Anastasia, head of what was then the Mangano family, later renamed Gambino, was assassinated in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. The hit was approved, or at least tolerated, by the commission. Anastasia had become erratic and unpredictable, a liability in the eyes of other bosses. From my perspective as a historian, this moment shows both the power and fragility of Luciano's invention. On one hand, the fact that a boss could be removed through consensus without a full-blown war proved that the commission had authority. On the other hand, it also revealed that the commission could become a front for quiet coups, power plays, and internal betrayals disguised as policy. Still, through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the mafia's structure, thanks to Luciano's foundation, allowed for unprecedented coordination and influence. They had judges on payrolls, union bosses in their pockets, politicians who owed favors, and industries, from concrete to shipping to casinos, that couldn't move without Cosa Nostra approval. But the FBI was watching. In 1957, the infamous Appalachian Conference happened, a secret meeting of over 100 mobsters from across the country, held in upstate New York. Law enforcement raided the meeting and exposed for the first time publicly the true scale of the mafia's national network. This was the first major blow to Luciano's grand design. Until then, many officials and much of the public didn't even believe in a national crime syndicate. But the Appalachian bust shattered that illusion. Suddenly, it was clear the mafia was real, and it wasn't just a collection of local thugs, it was an empire. That meeting, in many ways, forced law enforcement to start thinking like Lucky Luciano had, organizationally. But perhaps the biggest irony in Luciano's legacy is this: the very structure he created to stabilize the mafia became the framework that allowed the FBI to dismantle it. How? Because structure means predictability, and predictability is a prosecutor's best friend. When the FBI began leveraging the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, also known as RICO, in the 1970s and 80s, it targeted the very hierarchy Luciano had built. With RICO, agents didn't need to catch a boss committing a crime personally. They just had to prove that he was the head of a criminal enterprise and that members of his organization committed crimes on its behalf. That's how they brought down bosses like Paul Castellano, Tony Dux Corallo, and eventually John Gotti. From my perspective as a historian, Luciano's creation of the commission was both a masterpiece of criminal architecture and a tragic inevitability. It worked brilliantly in a pre-digital world, where loyalty was tight, surveillance was clumsy, and snitches were rare. But in the modern era, where phone taps, hidden microphones, flipped witnesses, and forensic accounting became standard, structure stopped being a strength and became a roadmap for prosecutors. It's also worth exploring the ethical ambiguity of Luciano himself. He's often glamorized, portrayed as a visionary gangster, a reformer of crime, a man who cleaned up the underworld. But let's not sanitize history. This is a man who ran prostitution rings, who was implicated in brutal murders, and who saw people, even allies, as expendable if they got in the way of progress. Luciano wasn't benevolent, he was efficient, and efficient men in the criminal underworld don't survive without being ruthless. Yet it's impossible to ignore his intelligence. Unlike many mobsters of his era, Luciano understood power not as a throne, but as a network. He knew that long-term dominance came not from fear alone, but from mutual interest. His commission wasn't just a mob innovation, it was a governance model, one that rivaled the decision-making efficiency of governments and corporations. In fact, some business historians argue that Luciano's commission bore similarities to corporate boards of directors: shared risk, shared reward, internal arbitration, and enforced discipline. The difference: their penalties involved bullets, not board votes. Let's also look at counterpoint number 2. Some argue Luciano's commission was bound to fail, that criminal organizations by nature are too competitive, too volatile, and too reliant on personal loyalty to sustain institutional governance. Rebuttal: that perspective ignores the decades in which it did work. From the 1930s to the 1980s, Luciano's structure allowed the mafia to avoid dozens of wars, manage billions in illegal revenue, and infiltrate major industries without collapsing from internal strife. In a criminal world where ego, pride, and vendetta often trump logic, Luciano's commission was, at least for a time, a genius mechanism to keep the machine running. But make no mistake, the commission did not erase mafia violence, it just managed it. Hits still happened, they just had to be approved, Wars still broke out, they were just postponed, and traitors were still punished, just with the quiet approval of a boardroom, not a gunman's lone decision. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. Luciano wanted to replace chaos with order, but in doing so, he didn't remove the blood, he simply organized it. After Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, many believed his influence would fade, that his days of shaping the underworld were over. But from my perspective as a historian, this is where the myth ends and the reality deepens. Even from exile, Luciano's fingerprints remained all over the American Mafia. He maintained contact with top bosses, especially through his longtime associate Meyer Lansky, who continued to play a pivotal role in the syndicate's financial infrastructure, particularly in Havana, Las Vegas, and Swiss banking circles. Luciano also had indirect influence over the heroin trade, an operation that would later haunt the Commission during the so-called French Connection era. While Luciano denied involvement publicly, multiple intelligence agencies believed he helped facilitate heroin trafficking routes from Europe into the US through Cuba and Sicily. Whether or not Luciano orchestrated the drug pipelines himself, the system he built, the network of bosses, territories, and policies, made it possible for narcotics to flow without one boss needing to know the full picture. In other words, his genius in compartmentalizing power also made the organization harder to stop. But every empire eventually hits its wall. As the decades passed, the American Mafia began to crack, not through a single war or betrayal, but through 1,000 tiny leaks. Guys flipped, wires were planted, courtroom deals were made, and most damningly, the Commission itself became a target. In 1985, the Mafia Commission trial landed like a bomb. Prosecutors, led by Rudy Giuliani, used RICO to indict and convict the heads of the 5 families, including Tony Dux Corallo, Carmine Persico, and Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. This was the moment Luciano's masterpiece officially unraveled. The very structure that had given the mob order now gave prosecutors a schematic for total decapitation. With the Commission gutted, the Mafia's ability to mediate disputes, approve hits, and enforce policy collapsed. What followed was chaos, splinter factions, unsanctioned hits, turf battles, and eventually massive arrests. From my view as a historian, this collapse is critical to understanding modern organized crime. Order allowed for profit, structure allowed for dominance, but once that structure was gone, Cosa Nostra became just another criminal outfit, reactive, fragmented, and vulnerable. And so we return to Luciano, not the man, but the myth. How do we reconcile a figure who both stabilized and doomed the Mafia, who created peace only to lay the foundation for collapse? Let's not forget, Luciano was never romantic about the work. He famously said, "There's no such thing as good money or bad money, there's just money." To him, the Mafia wasn't a sacred brotherhood, it was a business, one that needed rules, leadership, and vision to survive. What he created was undeniably effective. The Commission was the most powerful criminal boardroom in American history. It made billions, it kept hundreds of killers in check, it allowed for global coordination, but in the end, it also exposed its members to the full weight of modern law. So what do we take away from all this? Here's the final truth. Luciano didn't invent the Mafia, he revolutionized it, and like all revolutions, his came with consequences. By making the Mafia more organized, he also made it more accountable, more traceable, more vulnerable to attack. That's the legacy he leaves us, not just as a gangster, but as the man who turned crime into a corporation and gave the underworld its golden age, and maybe its expiration date. But what do you think? Was Luciano a criminal genius who brought order to chaos, or did he build a system that was always doomed to turn on itself? Drop your take in the comments. Hit that like button if you think more people need to hear the real history behind these headlines, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And I'll leave you with this. The difference between a gangster and a businessman? Timing. Lucky Luciano. Luciano's timing was perfect, and for a while, so was the Mafia he built.